reasons that he gave and so many more. And I just want to give a little kind of autobiographical background context that will add one little data point to why we're all here, I think. Everyone has a fascinating story of how they came here. This is mine, and hopefully it'll add a little greater context to what you see going on here and what you're experiencing. And participate more in the Biennale, which is also happening at the same time and at the end of March. So for those who haven't been, I'd like to introduce you to that. This was my mentor at UC Berkeley. I studied philosophy. I wanted to study architecture, thinking it was a practical endeavor. And instead, I took an elective with this guy called Existentialism in Literature and Film. And my life course was changed because I didn't think it was possible to be a philosopher without being an academic. And I knew I didn't want to be an academic. So I didn't think philosophy, which was something I loved, would be something I could pursue. But Hubert Dreyfus showed that film could be, or literature, could be great media in which to explore, and perhaps even better media to explore philosophy than the traditional academic paper. And he became famous in the 1960s. Oh, one little aside. One of the PhD students when I was at Berkeley was named Eric Kaplan. He went on, and you'll meet him. He was here at the Biennale and will be here more, and actually wants to get a place in Bombay Beach. He went on to be a writer for The Simpsons and for Futurama and many other great shows, and he based Farnsworth on Dreyfus, Hubert J. Farnsworth. And Farnsworth teaches at Mars University. So everything comes in a circle. Anyway, Dreyfus became famous in the 60s for writing this book. The other purpose of this talk is to lovingly push back on some of the unbridled optimism I feel about technology emanating from Mars sometimes. I'm someone who loves technology, loves its promise, but also I want to give a little humanity back, or a reminder of what makes us human. It can't be captured in technology. So what Dreyfus did in the 60s, he was a professor at MIT, which was at the forefront of the AI revolution at the time. At the time, they were saying that by 1967, computers would be able to do anything that human beings can do. Does that story sound familiar? And the way his critique came wasn't from a technological or engineering perspective, but from a philosophy perspective. He thought that the whole AI program was based on an outdated vision of what it is to be a human being. And there's a tendency amongst humans to always reduce both the nature of reality and the nature of what it is to be human to whatever the latest clever invention that human beings have come up with is. So at the very beginning, when human beings came up with laws, they said the universe must be following laws. Not that these laws actually might maybe just describe what nature does, but that nature follows the laws much like human beings follow laws. Then in the 1700s, we invented the clock and the machine. All of a sudden, the universe is a clock, and it's like clockwork, and it runs like a machine. Then all of a sudden, there was steam engines were invented, and people thought human beings are, the heart's a pump, everything works like a steam engine. In the 50s, the computer was invented, and all of a sudden, everyone said, okay, well, what it is to be human must be to have a hardware computer and running software, and if we can program computers in the right way, pretty soon we're going to have computers that can do everything that human beings can do. And to this day, now we come up with simulations, we have VR, and people think the universe must be a simulation. And then we come up with LLMs, and people say, well, actually, human beings are just next topic predictors. And that's partly true. It captures some truth. Like, I'm trying to figure out what the next word is always. But the idea that Dreyfus had was that there's a lot more to being human than can be reduced to our latest clever invention. And specifically, we are not symbol processing machines. What it is to be human is to have a body and to be in a world of shared practices, and that where things show up as significant. And basically, this was the sequel, what computers still can't do, because 1967 came and went, and computers still couldn't do all the things that humans can do. So after I graduated from Berkeley, I went looking for the best examples of being human in this way that was like engaged in skillful practices in our bodies. Dreyfus also predicted that we should use neural networks to have AI, because instead of, they're more like human brains. But what he would say about today's AIs is that it got half of the equation right, but it's still missing like bodies and shared practices in a specific time and a specific place. So I decided I wanted to become a documentary filmmaker and find worlds of shared skillful practices and significance. And the example I found that was most compelling was the flamenco world. So I went to Spain and spent a year documenting what I thought was this very authentic, very specific culture. And I got very inspired by this. Made my first feature film called Flamenco: A Personal Journey. And then when I came back to the United States, I bought an old school bus on eBay. And this was the bus. It was called the Los Angeles Filmmakers Cooperative. And the idea was, one thing you can do to resist kind of the technological invasion of dehumanization of our culture is to go to a traditional culture like the flamenco culture, or you can like do what Heidegger did, which is like live in the Black Forest and pretend that modernity is not happening. But I thought what would be more interesting is to try and take up technology in an authentic way. Not let it overtake you, but how can we use technology which is made sometimes to make us more passive, but use it actively in a way that's against itself. So the most great example of this, as Atten kind of hinted at too, is that like a DJ at a party is doing something. The record was made to be a passive purveyor of music, decontextualized. Never in their wildest dreams did the inventors of the record player imagine that someone could actively be DJing and having people around them and using skill or her to gather people in a meaningful temporary autonomous zone. So that's what we tried to do inside this bus. And so the idea was to put editing systems inside the bus and travel around and meet artists in communities and try and make films with and about them. And I thought this was a very solitary, crazy idea, but this was 2001, and somebody told me about Burning Man, and I'd never heard of it. So this was the LA Times article about the bus. And you can see the height of technology back then. Older G3 systems and Ethernet cables, and anyway. So then someone told me about Burning Man, and in 2001 we took the bus and we went to the Burning Man festival, and I found 25,000 like-minded individuals who were interested in creating community outside of the normal capitalist systems, and who were part of a kind of an avant-garde, I think. We're mixing technology and community. And I think that was the essential part, is like being in a specific time in a specific place. And this was the bus at Burning Man in 2001. And then we got back to Venice Beach, where I was living, in the bus. And I put up flyers around town saying, if you want to work outside of the Hollywood system, you should come by this parking lot I had the bus parked in, behind the Rose Cafe, if anyone knows Venice Beach. Now it's Google, ironically. And I put flyers around town, and I said, if you want to work outside the Hollywood system, you should come and meet other like-minded individuals. And there was no, there was hardly any internet back then. We had no internet in the bus, so it was just flyers around town. And in walks this guy. He's barefoot, he's got a long beard, dreads, and I'm trying to be very inclusive, everybody's welcome. And this guy starts asking me questions about, like, how are you financing the bus? And do you have 501c3 status? And where are you getting all this equipment? And finally I was like, why are you asking me all this? And this gentleman says, well, I started a tech company a few years ago, and I made some money, and now I wander the earth helping people who are doing cool things like you. And this person was Freeman, who looks exactly the same. So he said, what do you need? I said, well, I had my dirty socks in the back of the bus, and I said, well, I tried to run a anarchist filmmakers collective out of a school bus while at the same time sleeping in the back, and it's really small, and really we need a building. So Freeman said, well, why don't we rent a building? And this is Freeman, this is the parking lot where I had my meetings, and there's Freeman and two other friends. And so Freeman rented us this building, which was a powerhouse back in the 20s, and Ray Bradbury grew up in it because his dad worked for Southern California Edison, and he wrote the Martian Chronicles in the guest house here. But the space was empty, and so Freeman had this brilliant idea of filling it with pallet racks. And so this was the bus, the powerhouse, the works, and then so here was the first iteration of the pallet racks. And this was the bus. This was another little, and so basically we opened it up to the community and said anybody who wants to come in and occupy a space can do so, as long as they just have a project and like working in community. And so for a year, we ran this space together. Freeman stopped wandering the earth for a year and settled down in this building. And we had, we would have these amazing events, like this was Liz Estrada put on in protest of the Iraq War, where 1,000 different productions were put on at the same time to protest the coming war. We brought the bus to San Francisco for a war protest. This was another protest of Code Pink. This was a typical meeting, which looks amazingly like this, right? So, then I went back and, so then Freeman, after a year, oh my God, time is too quick, trying to tell a whole life story in 15 minutes, but bear with me. After this 1 year, 2003, I lost touch with Freeman, and I went back to living in my bus, and for 15 years, I didn't hear from Freeman. And he went off to India, and I hope that he will tell that story one day if he hasn't already. I made another film called Being in the World, which is a celebration of being human in a technological age, and it was going back to revisit Dreyfus and his ideas, and it's all about like skillful coping and the importance of skillful mastery and how it brings meaning and how it resists technology. And Dreyfus died a few years ago, and then I was in 2010 perusing a bookstore and found this book by Kim Stringfellow about the Salton Sea. And I couldn't believe that I'd never heard of this place because it's 3 hours from LA, and I grew up in LA, and I was like, this is amazing. This is like everything I loved, kind of the outside, the edges of Americana, but it's also like what happens when you have too much hubris and too much optimism, maybe. And so I got in my car and I found this town, Bombay Beach, and I couldn't believe how weird and wonderful it was and how specific it was. And so I brought my friend Mark Rathall, who was also a student of Dreyfus's and now is a professor at Oxford, and I said, what would it take to do a philosophy conference in Bombay Beach? And he said, it wouldn't take much because philosophers love to talk, so if you just invite them here, they will happily give talks. And so, so that was one of the initial seedlings of the idea for the Bombay Beach Biennale, was to bring a serious academic philosophy conference to the shores of the Salton Sea in this very unexpected place. Then I made a film called Monogamish and met one of the co-founders, Lily Johnson-White, who hopefully you'll meet soon. And the third founder is Stefan Ashkenazi, who's a very amazing visionary who did a camp at Burning Man, and that was Susan Sarandon, and this was just before we drank cocktails spiked with a little bit of Timothy Leary's ashes at Burning Man. And he was the perfect cohort to bring this vision to reality. This is Stefan again at Burning Man in 2015.
Who's the clown?
What's that?
Who's the clown?
Who is the clown? I've forgotten her name. So in 2016, we launched the first Bombay Beach Biennale. This was the Opera House, one of Stefan's amazing projects with James Ostrer. And hold on, why is this going back to Burning Man? What was I about? Is it 15 minutes?
Just Keep going.
Okay. In Palm Springs, they do Modernism Week. It's a very earnest celebration of modernist design and culture. So we thought, why don't we do Postmodernism Week, where the foundations are not so solid as we might think of Western civilization. And here's the Polaroid Museum. Here's another art piece by Scott Fitzel. This was the Tesseract, which is another amazing story, which I don't have time to tell. And then this is my version of getting an Academy Award. Just last week, I was invited to go speak at Berkeley at the graduation. So everything has come full circle again. That's it.